Hello, welcome to the St. Mary's University Writing Centre workshop on note-taking and listening. As the title of this workshop indicates, what we will cover here is note-taking and listening. Perhaps to start off, a good question to ask is, why do we take notes in the first place? Generally speaking, there are a few reasons, perhaps 4 reasons why we take notes. The most important one is clearly because our memory is not very good. There are studies that have been undertaken that indicate that we tend to forget about half of what we've heard within the first 20 minutes, and perhaps as much as 2/3 of what we've heard after the end of the day, right? So one reason of why we take notes is because our memories are not very good, and by writing things down, we can remember at a later point, or at least we have an easier time remembering what we've heard at a later point in time. The second reason why we take notes is because note-taking helps us concentrate. It focuses our minds. When we start writing things down, we are focused on a particular task, and it helps us concentrate. The third reason why we take notes is perhaps a bit more mundane, but taking notes also helps us practice our handwriting skills. So this can come in quite handy when it comes to writing an exam, which you will most likely have to write in longhand. So if you take notes in longhand, it will come in handy later in the term when you have to write an exam. As currently university takes place online, you might also think about perhaps taking notes on the computer, and in doing so you might also practice your typing skills, because the exams you will be taking in this online environment will take place online, of course, and you might have to write the exam on the computer. So by taking notes on the computer, you're also practicing those motor skills that might come in handy at a later point in time. The fourth reason is not directly related to university, but note-taking, of course, also takes place outside of the educational environment during meetings, and many of you will have done that already perhaps. There's usually one person who takes notes and keeps the minutes, right? So, and the minutes is nothing but a record of the meeting that everyone agrees on. So when people come together later at a later point in time, they have a record of what was discussed and what was agreed upon at the previous meeting, so people don't have to start from scratch in this following meeting. So in general, so there's 4 reasons. Perhaps the most important one is our memory is not very good, and taking notes helps us remember things. The other reasons being it helps us concentrate, it helps us practice our writing skills, our motor skills, and last but not least, there are also applications to note-taking outside of an educational setting. When we look at the note-taking process as a whole, it's embedded within the learning process, and this can be illustrated via this process here, which indicates, of course, the baking of a cake. So the various ingredients which are put together and then given a particular form, then put in the oven in order to create a cake. In a classroom setting, these ingredients would be readings, lectures, and hands-on learning, which are thrown into a bowl and then mixed together, which essentially would be the note-taking process. Then during the review process, perhaps the dough that's been created is molded in a particular shape and then put into the oven, which could relate to the studying process itself. And then the outcome would then be a particular grade. And the better, the more time is spent perhaps on each of these elements, the mixing, the reviewing, and the studying, the better the outcome will be in the end. This illustration is also quite useful because you can read it backwards as well. So if you aspire to a particular grade, ideally speaking A or an A+ in a course, you need to have you need to study, right? And in order to be able to study, you need to have something that you study, something that you can review, and that's where the notes come in. You don't want to. There won't be enough time towards the end of the course when you have to prepare for the exam, to read everything again, right? So you will have to rely on the notes that you've taken throughout the term. So that's where the note taking comes in, right? So it's central to your experience at university, especially the learning outcomes in the courses that you're enrolled in. The last element I think that's worth mentioning here is that, and it's indicated by this brain here, that each of these elements involve a significant amount of brain power, not only the studying but also the note taking, as will become clear in the course of this workshop. At university, if you want to be a successful university, there are a few things that you need to do. A few, it's fairly basic, to be honest, but sometimes not perhaps easy, because there's many other things that you probably want to do during your university. But in terms of your academic success at university, it's key that you go to class, that you listen to what is discussed in class, that you comprehend. Comprehend is meaning that you're trying to understand what is being said, and all of these three elements come together in the note-taking process, right? So you need to take notes, but you can only take notes when you go to class or when you're in an online environment, when you log on to an online lecture. So you need to go to class, you need to listen, you cannot take notes if you're not listening, and also you need to comprehend, you need to distill some of the key information that's being discussed and put this information in your notes, right? So that's where note-taking is a fairly complex task. It brings several elements and several skills together, but it's very important for your success at university. When you go to class, or before you go to class, there are a few things that you can do and perhaps you should do, as this will also make the note-taking during the class itself easier, right? So you want to come to class prepared, not only by bringing paper and pens and certain kinds of questions, but you need to do a certain kind of reading, you need to prepare yourself mentally, and it's also perhaps indicated in the questions itself. You need to be able to ask questions, you need to come to class with questions that you seek answers for, right? And in order to do so, there are a few things that you can do. The first thing is you read the syllabus. A syllabus is something that will be presented to you at the beginning of a course, and it's a fairly detailed outline of the different kinds of assignments that you have to complete in the course, and also will most likely give you a fairly detailed rundown of what is going to be covered at particular weeks in the course, right? So by just reading through the syllabus on a weekly basis or before class, you will know what will be discussed in this particular class. So this helps you prepare yourself mentally. The next thing is read through the assigned readings, right? Each class will probably have some kind of articles or short readings that you have to do in order to take part in conversations and discussions. So you want to make sure that you read the text that you have to read, so you come prepared and have questions that you seek answers for. And last but not least, later on in the course, you'll have significant amounts of notes that will have accumulated, and by just looking at the notes from the previous class, you will also remember what was talked about the previous class and perhaps the weeks before. And it's important because usually courses are organized according to a particular structure, right? So the information that's discussed in a certain week builds on information that was presented the week before, or the class before. So that's usually a fairly a useful kind of strand, I suppose, that runs through each of these courses. But just reviewing the notes from the previous session, previous class, will help you be prepared and mentally prepared for the class that you will take part in. Okay, so the important thing is, before you go to class, make sure you read the syllabus, go through the assigned readings, and by going through the assigned readings means reading and taking notes on the readings, and then also review your previous notes. When you're in class, you need to concentrate on your listening skills. So you need, on the one hand, you need to pay attention. You need to listen for cues in the conversation, in the discussion that takes place, and you need to take notes. In order to do all of these things, you need to minimize distractions. And as we're all working from home at the moment, there are plentiful distractions around, so you want to make sure to limit those and minimize those as much as possible. In order to do so, it's probably a good idea to create and prepare a work area. It might not always be possible, but you could at least try. And one way of doing so is perhaps to make sure that the work area is cleared from all the clutter and anything that might be remotely distracting, that the lighting is suitable. Perhaps if you're working from a screen, that the brightness of the screen is not too harsh. The next thing would be that you might want to sit in a position that helps you concentrate. Yeah, if you want to sit comfortably and actively and attentively, maybe not too comfortably. You don't want to doze off during a lecture. Perhaps you want to be actively involved in what is being discussed, and body posture might go some ways towards that. The third thing would then be to take notes with pen and paper rather than typing on the laptop. This is important perhaps because by just writing things down in longhand, you are creating a personalized document, right? It's your own handwriting, and you establish maybe a bit more of a personal connection to what you're writing down. And this might also help you concentrate, as I indicated before, and might help you understand better what is being discussed as you see the thoughts and your own thoughts and what you hear materialize on the page in front of you. A laptop might not be able to give you that experience and give you that support here. And the next point would be, if you're working from a computer especially, to make sure that there's no distractions on the computer itself. So close all unrelated tabs and programs, and perhaps also consider using a self-control app, so at least which would make it more difficult for you to get distracted by just clicking on various other things on your computer, opening various other programs on your computer. And similar to the classroom, mobile phones tend to be big distractions. So make sure that your mobile phone is as far away as possible during class, and this also goes for other electronics that might be distracting. Okay, so you want to dedicate your undivided attention to the class that you're attending. This is very important because let's say if you're having a 45-minute lecture that you're attending, and you'd want to take notes during this 45 minutes, the idea being that you want to spend these 45 minutes only once, right? Because time is very precious during university. You don't want to do the same thing twice or three times. Right? I'm listening to the lecture, but I'm not really paying attention, which means I have to go back. If it's an online setting where the lecture might be recorded, I have to go back afterwards and listen to the recording again and then take notes. You're essentially then spending twice the amount of time, and this time will be missed, or will be missed in some other aspect of your study. Okay, so you want to be as focused and concentrated as possible during lectures, during online class activity, so as to give you as much time to do other kinds of tasks that you have to complete in the course of your studies. When we're looking at the kind of ingredients, if you like, so there's the different kinds of inputs. So input meaning the way in which information is going to be presented to you. This is the same in an online environment as well as in the physical classroom. So there's the visual presentations, there's speech, of course, that will accompany the visual presentation. Sometimes there might only be speech on its own, and also whiteboard for the gradual development of content. If we look at the first of these items here, so visual presentation, most commonly it's going to be different kinds of PowerPoint slides. The first slide here is a fairly detailed and packed slide. It's generally the term to use for these kind of slides is information slides. It's packed with information. The question then, what would you write down where you're confronted with that kind of information? Perhaps not everything, right? This might be, this slide might be, distilling information from an article you might have had to read for class. So in reading the article, you will already know the main points, perhaps, that will feature on this slide. If that's not the case, make sure you identify the main points and attempt to summarize the main ideas on this slide. So usually This slide will not be presented on its own, but there's going to be speech that accompanies the slide, and the important thing would be to listen closely as to various kinds of pointers that you're presented with, so that you know which specific information on the slide you need to focus on, and make sure to note that down. Okay. So in addition to that, focus on bold and italicized words, certain kinds of definitions that you're not familiar with. You might be familiar with some of them, but perhaps the ones that you're not familiar with might be worth noting down, or at least making a record of that. But the same goes for numbers and statistics. With information slides and all other kinds of slides that you will be presented with in the course of your university studies, it's important to note that many of these slides will most likely be made available to you after class. So it's probably no use to copy down all the information that's presented here. It might be useful just to keep a record of the speech that accompanies the slide itself. When moving on to the next kind of slide, which is commonly referred to as a clean slide because it just has headlines, no full sentences. What is important perhaps about this kind of slide is that you can use these bullet points as subheadings or as headings to organize your notes, right? The important thing is that, again, similar to the previous slide, that the speech that accompanies the slide is perhaps equally important, if not more important than the slide itself, because by noting down the term itself, overgrazing, for example, that might not be enough when it comes to the exam. You might have to contextualize this term in relation to specific geographic areas or historical time periods, etc. So the important thing here would be to note down the headings and use those headings to organize your notes, right? Important thing as well about clean slides might be that the information that's compacted into these kinds of slides could also be featured then in an exam. So in this instance, courses of the certification, there are various kinds of instances, and it might be useful to have all of these terms together with descriptions and like a record of what your professor considers to be very important to note about each of these courses of the certification, right? When we look at the final example of a slide here, a picture slide, it's perhaps a bit more difficult to think about what you might note down here. Generally speaking, picture slides are used to elicit some kind of response from students, right? So your professor might not speak an awful lot when it comes to picture slide, but other students might contribute a fair amount of information here. So the same as in the previous slides is to pay close attention what is being said, what is important, what you're meant to be focusing on. And then you use the keywords that feature and questions that come up, that are presented, and also titles that might come up in the conversation, and record those in your notes and structure your notes accordingly, right? When we're moving on to speech itself, so if there's no visual support, it's perhaps more difficult and perhaps less common in an online environment. You might find this in an in-classroom, in a physical classroom space, perhaps more often than an online environment, but you might in some courses, rather than there being a PowerPoint presentation with a voiceover, you might have, a professor might just record a podcast which you can listen to. So what you would have to do then is listen to particular kinds of signal words that might help you identify what's important, and also give you some idea as to how to structure your notes, okay? So moving on, for example, first, next, first, second, third, etc. in summary. So then this will help you identify whether something is worth noting down, something is perhaps more just contextualization, or whether something is essential information to record because it will be featuring in the exam. Okay, so listening closely to some of these signal words will make your life much easier. This takes us back to what I mentioned before, namely note-taking is a fairly complex task, and this complex task involves different kinds of skills, and it's also a skill that can be developed in the course of university studies. So by doing it more often, you get better at it, right? So by the important thing is the complexity of note taking, of course, is based on that you're doing several things at once, right? You're listening, you're trying to process what you're hearing, understanding what you're hearing, and then also trying to keep a record of this distilled version of what is being said, right? You can't, keeping writing down sentences verbatim of what the professor is saying, but you're distilling what you're hearing and writing it down in your own words, perhaps even just short phrases, etc. Right? So there's many different tasks involved in that, and this is something that you will get better in as in the course of your university studies. When we move on to the next point of the next way information, next form perhaps, information can be presented in a classroom. This is the same in an online classroom as in a physical classroom. The whiteboard has a specific function, namely that it allows professors to involve students, similar to the picture slides before, but also outline certain kinds of processes and involve students in creating processes, right? Student input in creating these processes. Generally speaking, if something's written down on the whiteboard, it tends to be important. So it's probably worthwhile noting this down. The other thing being is that similar to the other slides, the PowerPoint slides that we talked about a minute ago, is that don't limit yourself to what is written down on the whiteboard. It's not just a word, but kind of how this word is talked about, how this word is contextualized, how this word is used in the context of the lecture or in relation to the issues that are being explored in class, right? So you need to fill in the blanks with commentary and descriptions, essentially, okay? The last element of learning is something that's referred to as hands-on learning. It's a different form than, of course, the lecture or a lecture that's given with PowerPoint slides or just with speech on its own or using a whiteboard. In hands-on learning, it's pretty much left on your own. So these are practicals and applied components of a course. Essentially, while there might be additional material available that might give you some indication of some guidance in how you are meant to complete certain kinds of tasks, but with hands-on learning, it's most important that you keep a detailed record of whatever you're doing, right? Because this record is going to be essential for follow-up tasks that you have to complete. So keeping a journal or keeping detailed notes on what you're doing during these hands-on learning exercises, right? When we're moving on then to the note-taking itself, so there are different kinds of methods that we'll briefly talk about, and also a very brief conversation on the content that will feature in the notes themselves. When we're looking at the methods, there are three methods that are fairly common. One is the flowcharts, the mind maps, and the Cornell method. You will probably have heard of all of them, perhaps not by name, but you will perhaps have I've used these kinds of methods, perhaps without knowing these terms. So a flowchart essentially is quite useful to illustrate processes. Interesting, or most usefully perhaps here, is that similar kinds of structures are allocated to similar shapes. So start and end have the same shape, whereas process has the same shape and input has a different kind of shape. And you create lines to connect these different kinds of elements in a process. Okay, so flow chart. And you can perhaps also indicate arrows to make clear which direction the flow goes, right? The process evolves. The next mode of method of note-taking might be mind maps, although they might be more useful perhaps for reviewing information, but essentially you put the subject matter at the center, and then you have these branching, these terms kind of centering around the main idea at the center, and these subcategories are connected via lines, and then these subcategories again subdivided into other categories. So that's quite useful to again structure the flow of a conversation the mind maps are also quite useful to show the general relationship of individual aspects of materials. If we go back, for example, to desertification, there might be various kind of different kinds of courses, such as overgrazing, etc., which might feature in some of these subtopics, which then can be further subdivided into perhaps different historical, maybe moments or geographic areas. As I mentioned before, mind maps perhaps might not be most useful for taking notes in the classroom itself, but they are very useful for reviewing and studying. The last method you might be familiar with already is generally like fairly good note-taking method. The Cornell method. Essentially, what you do here, you subdivide the sheet that you're writing on into 3 areas: the notes column, the Q column, and the summary column at the bottom. In class, you write down the information in the notes column during the class. Then after class, you create, you identify main ideas, create certain kinds of questions or study prompts. You write those down in the Q column. And also after class, you're moving to like the top level, where you identify again main ideas or write down some terms for quick reference. This again happens after class. And in doing so, you are already reviewing to some degree and processing the notes that you've created during the class. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so the Cornell method is quite useful because it incorporates the notes themselves and also creates some kinds of prompts, study prompts, that might be useful, or that can be useful for the review and study afterwards in the run-up to an exam. When we're looking at the note content, of course, in most instances, you will not want to write more than you have to. So it's probably very good to use shorthand symbols and abbreviations. You're probably aware or familiar with a fair amount of different kinds of symbols and abbreviations that you can use. You can also create your own. So just again, to indicate that notes that are written in longhand are a fairly personal record. Sometimes your notes may not make sense to somebody else because of the specific symbols that you've allocated, that you've created to remind yourself of what is important, or to make the writing process a bit more, a bit easier and also quicker. You will have, it's good to use headings and subheadings to structure your notes, perhaps also numbers and symbols to indicate the structure of ideas. You might want to use colored pens or highlighters to color code concepts or hierarchies of ideas. And what's perhaps most important to remember, it's notes are distilled. It's a distilled form of information, right? It's not copying. It's not like a copy, like a good copy of the actual content. It's a distilled version of a longer piece of writing, if you like. If you're taking notes on an essay or an article, or a distilled record of a longer oral presentation, right? So do not write down everything. Write down what's important to you, especially. Again, it's a personal record. It needs to make sense to you and not to somebody else. The last thing to mention here, and it's sometimes forgotten by students, is a fair amount of the note-taking process does not end with the end of the class itself, but it also continues after class. Namely, there's a review element that needs to take place as soon after class as possible. And the important thing here is that you want to, the main idea is that you want to create the most complete form that you will then can rely on at a later point in time when it comes to studying for the exam. So what you want to do, you reread your notes, you identify if there's anything missing, and you fill in the gaps. You also integrate the different kinds of notes into one source. So for example, you took notes on the reading, of some of the essays that you had to read before class, and then you combine those notes with the notes from the class itself, or perhaps from notes from a hands-on learning exercise, etc. So you bring all these notes together. You might also then present the notes when you're reviewing them, color coding them, etc. Maybe you might want to create a mind map if something is fairly complex. It might be become easy to conceptualize perhaps and understand by creating a mind map. And then you store all of that information in one folder, if you like. If it's online, create a folder for this one class, or if it's a physical classroom, create a folder for each class in a folder, right? Not on the computer, but in a folder. This is important because you want to make your life as easy as possible when it comes to preparing for an exam later in the term, right? As I indicated at the beginning of this brief workshop, note-taking is an essential tool for helping you remember what is talked about, what you studied, what you learned, what you discussed throughout the term, right? And having good notes from day one on will make your life much easier when it comes to completing various kinds of assignments during the term, but also preparing for the final exam at the end of term. And there's generally studies that have found that students that take notes tend to do significantly better than students that do not take notes, because usually at the end of term there's little time to catch up on something that you've missed. And even though if you've read an article in week 2 or week 3 and you didn't take notes on this article, you might not have time to reread the article in the run-up to an exam. So notes are essential for success at university. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you for taking part, and bye now.